So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Norm Baillie-David. Welcome to our webinar today. Today I'm going to be talking about diversity and inclusion as a driver of employee engagement. Before I get started, let me just give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to talk about is diversity and inclusion. I'm going to go through a little bit of background. You have to bear with me a little bit on this. It's such an interesting topic, and I think to get to where we are today in terms of understanding the link between diversity and inclusion and employee engagement, which is really the main essence of the topic. I think a little bit, a couple of minutes spent on some of the history and some of the background in both Canada and the United States will be helpful in terms of that understanding. And of course, the main essence of what we're going to be talking about is understanding not diversity and inclusion as a topic in and of itself, but really from our perspective as specialists in employee engagement, we want to understand the link between D&I and engagement, as said by not only the research, but of course through our experience as well with our own clients. And then I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to ask you a number of questions in terms of where you see or do you feel there are differences in your own organizations in engagement by the different diversity groups. And of course, we'll come back with some of the answers to that. So we'll do that in a poll type of fashion. It should be a little bit of fun as well. And then we're going to talk about what are the implications of all of this and really look at some of the best practices of some key organizations that are doing very, very well at this TalentMap client and others. And then, of course, I'm going to ask you to chip in as well. Things that you think that are working well in your organization with regards to diversity and inclusion. And, of course, we'll have full opportunity for a Q&A at the end of this. So at that point, I am going to point you to, you have a questions box on your right-hand side. And as we're going through, please feel free to enter a question. I'm not going to take them on the fly. We'll take them at the end of the session, simply because of the number of people that are on here. It would be a little bit distracting to try to attend to questions as we go through, and not to mention taking a lot of time. So in the interest of time, we'll address those questions at the end. And of course, you'll have opportunity to answer poll questions as well. So moving right along, just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know TalentMap. Having looked at the names and emails of those of you who registered and are attending today, some of you have worked with us, some of you have not yet worked for us. So where we are, we're essentially TalentMap is a specialist firm in workforce measurement and specifically engagement surveys, employee engagement. We've been around since 1999, so a little bit more than 15 years. Over that time, we've done thousands of surveys. Millions of employees have been surveyed, and of course, we're running at the pace where we're doing anywhere between 300 and 500 plus engagement surveys annually. But I think the real thing to understand here is TalentMap is really about one thing. We have one sole focus, and that is the improvement of your workforce, the measurement and management of workforce thinking, specifically around the topic of engagement. But we also do things like entry, exit, safety surveys, anything that touches your employees. On the screen in front of you, a quick snapshot, really quick, in terms of some of the clients that we work with. We work across the economy. Our major sectors tend to be not-for-profit, financial services, public sector, health, and a smattering of others, as you can see by the logos in front of you. I think that the only thing to retain from this, apart from some of the high-profile clients that we work with, is when I get to talking about our database and our benchmarks. Those are compiled essentially from the thousands of employees that have answered our surveys and the thousands of employees who have answered surveys touching on diversity and inclusion as well. So why are we talking about diversity and inclusion today? And really, it's about a trend that we've noticed, and I've noticed in particular over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years. Now, diversity and inclusion is not new. As I'm going to point out, I mean, it has a long history in both Canada and the United States in terms of its working through diversity in organizations, and I'll talk about some of that history. But what is new, what is fairly recent, is the link that the organizations are starting to feel between what they're doing or not doing in the diversity and inclusion space and employee engagement. And as organizations start to understand this link, we're getting more and more demand to include a diversity and inclusion piece in our engagement questionnaires, which we're doing much more frequently. And we're also counseling clients, as I'll circle right around, we're counseling clients to do this on their own. And the reasons why will become obvious as a part of this presentation. So let's get into a little bit of background at this point. Bear with me. If you work a lot in this space, I think that some of this will be a little bit pedantic, but I think to build context for what we're going to talk about in the diversity and inclusion space, some of this is really, really helpful. Of course, we start with a definition or definitions. Quickly, diversity refers to, there's many definitions out there. We like the one from SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management in the United States. The collective mixture of differences and similarities that include, for example, individual organizational characteristics, values, belief, experience, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. So basically the mixture of differences. But diversity and inclusion are twin sisters. We can't take really one without the other, and as I'm going to explain to you, diversity without inclusion is actually detrimental to the organization. We need both, and that's going to be one of the major themes, the major messages I'm going to harp on today is diversity needs inclusion. Of course, inclusion comes with diversity, but it's not automatic. And what we're looking for with inclusion is the achievement of that work environment in which all individuals, and I'll add to this definition, not only are treated fairly and respectfully, because that's a point of view, the individuals need to feel that they are treated fairly and respectfully. They need to feel they have equal access to opportunities and resources, and they also need to feel that they can contribute fully to the organization's success. The perception, really, inclusion is in the eye of the beholder. And as we're going to see, many organizations will tout that they have very, very strong and advocate diversity and inclusion policy, but when it comes right down to it, the employee through the engagement survey is saying, not so fast. We're not there yet. So we'll talk about that. Already, let's start this off by if diversity and inclusion is about different perspectives, then it's really interesting to note that right off the bat, we're not necessarily in agreement about what diversity and inclusion means. And one of our favorite ways to separate different populations, and it's also one of the key diversity groups, is by age. And when we're talking about millennials, it's really interesting to note this. Millennials see diversity and inclusion quite differently than boomers and Xers do. And millennials, if we're talking about diversity, they're talking about blending different backgrounds and perspectives into a team. And that's known as cognitive diversity. And really, it's very natural in today's day and age, both in Canada and the United States and in parts of Europe as well. Our experience is diversity is culture. It's, a diverse environment for a millennial is the way we do things. It has always been such, an attempt to include diversity, or where diversity doesn't exist, is actually an anomaly. Boomers and Xers, and of course I'm one of the boomers, if those of you who know me or have seen me, we view the diversity as fairness and protection as opposed to a collaborative environment. We view this as a moral imperative. We view this, it's fairness, protection for all regardless of your particular background or belief. And it's how this will manifest itself will become apparent as we get into some of the management practices. Now, inclusion for the boomers and the Xers is we want to integrate individuals of all the different demographics, the different diversity groups into one workplace. And for us, it's just the right thing to do. Whereas for millennials, it's already done in many, many cases. And where it doesn't exist, that's an anomaly. So obviously, we're beginning right off the bat with a little bit of a different perspective on what diversity and inclusion actually means. A little bit of history. Bear with me on this one. And the reason I'm bringing this out is because TalentMap works across North America, in both Canada and the United States, as well as some other areas of the world, but principally in the States and Canada. And diversity and inclusion mean quite different things, both north and south of the border. And the reason for that is it has its genesis is quite different. In the United States, my American friends will know this, that it really comes about as a result of the race history. And of course the Civil Rights Act being one of the key moments in time. And because it's born from the racial history of the United States and born from the Civil Rights Act, the emphasis has always been not necessarily about inclusion, but it's been about fairness and equality, equal access to resources, equal access to services, undiscriminatory access. Whereas in Canada, it's been quite different. Obviously, we don't share the same history around the race issue as the United States, and our approach to diversity has been quite different, and principally around the concept of what's called multiculturalism. And multiculturalism takes a different view. Multiculturalism celebrates differences, whereas in the United States, it's all about papering over and you know, trying to, I wouldn't say ignore differences, but the history is equality and fairness, and equality and fairness basically tries to iron out differences or to make, you know, to treat everyone the same. Whereas multiculturalism in Canada is about essentially allowing people to retain their differences within the larger culture. And as you can see here, there are certain elements or watersheds in time. Most notably, very recently, or more recently, we have in 2005 the Ontario Disability Act, in 2005 also the Civil Marriage Act, and of course throughout that is the policy of multiculturalism. And when we look at the two, there is an impact in terms of how this is affecting organizations. So if you look at one approach, a cultural approach, multiculturalism, versus the equality and diversity approach taken, and of course this is broad brush strokes, I'm stereotyping or generalizing a little bit. The research is showing that paradoxically, when we try to minimize group differences, in our good intent to ensure equality and fairness for all, when we minimize group differences, what we're actually doing in organizations is we're reinforcing the dominance of the majority and the marginalization of the minority, because what basically is happening is subjectively we're not allowing the group differences to allow themselves to manifest. So what that actually means is when we do acknowledge the difference, we are leading to better feelings and of inclusion. And of course, as I'm going to talk about a lot today, diversity without inclusion is really, can be much more harmful than good. Minimizing the differences, even when we're trying for equality for all, as such as, you know, I'm colorblind. I don't want to see color. I don't want to deal with color. Everybody is the same. That actually leads to less inclusion. I can't feel I am my full self. I need to minimize my difference with the majority, and we do see that there's engagement impact around that. So that just sets the scene to establishing the link between diversity and inclusion and employee engagement, which is really what we want to talk about today. The business case first. I mean, it was really easy in researching this topic, and really easy in terms of, you know, just talking about this to establish the business case. And unfortunately, what we actually do need to establish a business case for diversity and inclusion in the workplace, because just like even if we're talking about a group of white men, senior white men, who you know, tend to control a majority of the boardrooms and the executive suites in many corporations and organizations across North America and beyond, not everybody thinks the same about diversity and inclusion. Of course, that's the irony, is where these folks actually do have diverse beliefs, and in those diverse beliefs, not everybody is essentially convinced that doing the right moral thing, which we saw most boomers and Xers believe diversity and inclusion is just the right thing to do, but not everybody actually believes it's the right thing to do in every organization. So a business case needs to be built. But what's really, really easy is to find the ammunition for that business case. And you can see just a few points on the screen in front of you. There's many, many more. I've provided a number of links. So when this presentation, which will be available on our website in about 10 days, for those of you who are going to be asking for copies, it will be available on our website, as will as recording. There'll be plenty of sources to arm yourselves if you want to push hard for more diversity and inclusion policies and programs in your workplace. First of all, I mean, those who disregard diversity as a component of the business strategy have higher levels of disengagement. Those who capitalize on the strengths have the most engagement. There's studies that show that. There's a link to some of that research in front of you. Those companies with more women on the board are outperforming their peers. Inclusive teams outperform their peers. Gender diverse companies are more likely, ethnically diverse companies are more likely to outperform their peers. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the theoretical, the academic, and the industrial research that's proving beyond any doubt that diversity and inclusion is good for the business. Now, essentially what I'd like to ask you essentially is, who's measuring and managing diversity as it relates to employee engagement? As I said before, the link itself is a relatively recent phenomenon. People were implementing diversity much more out of compliance, and because some, think basically the right thing to do in many cases, before they actually realize that, hey, wait a second, this may have some impact on engagement. So who's actually doing this research? Who's asking us who's more aware? Police organizations want to reflect their community. The diversity urge is very, very strong, and they want to understand how the diversity in those organizations is leading to better community policing. We're seeing a lot of demand from the state and provincial, local government level, essentially, as this is not just politically correct, but there's also, imperatives, moral, business, and otherwise, to make sure that governments are reflecting the communities that they serve, both at the state level, the provincial level, in North America, as well as the municipal level. We're also finding not-for-profits are increasingly looking at this, and they're looking at it because they want to reflect their membership, and also because the recipients of the donations, the donors, also are looking to not-for-profits, and there is, of course, a strong moral imperative to do the right thing. Very, very interesting as well. The largest corporations in America are starting to do this, and starting to do this in spades. Bear with me. I'm going to try and hit on a link here that's going to open up a page on the Diversity Inc., which is a wonderful website. I'll leave a link for it on. You look at the Diversity Inc. top 50 list, and when you see in front of you are some of the, of course, the creme de la creme of American corporations. Kaiser Permanente, EY, AT&T, the big consulting firms tend to be up here. I'm going to talk about cases in particular about number 5 and number 6, Sodexo and PricewaterhouseCoopers. But when you look at that list, you have a glance at that list, you can see very, very quickly that these are the Fortune 100 companies that are taking a business interest. They have realized that there is that link, and they're very active in terms of acting on that link as well. So let me go back here now to our presentation itself here. And of course, in Canada, we're seeing our financial institutions, our major banks, very similar to corporate America, take a keen interest in this, both insurance companies and the banks. So those, many other organizations, but really these are the organizations that are taking sort of the lead in terms of measuring and managing this in a proactive manner, not necessarily only because it's the right thing to do, but because they also are beginning to believe in its link to employee engagement. But it's also interesting when we look at a maturity model that you can see in front of you. We see organizations from the smallest to the largest all go through phases of maturity with regards to diversity and inclusion. And I'm not necessarily talking about its link to engagement here. I'm just talking about implementing policies and programs where, there's really no no buy-in whatsoever from the leadership. They don't know about D&I. They're not aware of D&I. They don't really see an impact of D&I in their own organizations. That's really at the beginning, up to organizations that are claiming that this is part of what we do. We're leading best practice. We're one of those Diversity Inc. top 50. Most organizations, when we initiate the conversation with them about diversity and inclusion, they're talking as if they're right here. The conversation is, yes, diversity and inclusion is very important to us. We're implementing these policies and programs. We understand the need. We want to measure it. But when we actually do the measurement, we're seeing that really many organizations, even the ones that I pointed out on the previous slide, are actually still only in the compliance mode. And that basically means it's an imperative. We need to do it. We need to, in Canada, for example, a lot of the motivation, as good as it is that we're starting about this, it's because to be eligible for federal government contracts, you have to show diversity in your organization. You have to reveal different statistics. So it really is around the compliance. And then as that organization matures, they begin to see that this is important to our success. So most of our organizations are still in the early stages. And this is why we're seeing, even though diversity and inclusion as a concept has been around for about 15 years or so, if not more, we're actually seeing organizations just starting to get up the curve. Yes, there are some that are at the top, but most organizations are really sort of in the beginning stages of the curve. Let me talk to you a little bit now around our own experience with our own clients. Of course, I'm not going to name any clients by name, but there's definitely a trend in what we're seeing around diversity and inclusion and its impact around employee and engagement. So first, what I'd like to show you is very quickly, and you don't have to scribble down these notes, are some of the main questions that we're asking. Now, it's within the context of your standard employee engagement survey, where we're measuring a whole range of different dimensions around what engages employees, and where we're looking at in terms of diversity, respect, and inclusion. Now, these questions, there's very few of them. This is not a full survey in and of itself, but what we're looking to see are essentially the inclusion aspects as much as we're looking for the diversity aspects. Now, some organizations are actually asking the identity questions as well. So they're asking for identification or self-identification as a member of the different diversity groups, and that's often very helpful. Sometimes they already, organizations already have that within their HRIS. And so we're able to do tabulations of levels of engagement by some of these groups. We'll talk about that in about 5 minutes or so as to where people are falling out. But when we're talking about the connection with engagement, we're looking for feelings of acceptance, of comfort, of safety, of inclusion. Working, are we feeling valued? Are we reflecting, does our workforce reflect the diversity of the community? As we saw, policing, municipalities, governments, these are some of the key organizations that are asking these questions, and their main motivation is they feel that they need to reflect the communities that they serve. We need to feel we reflect the customers that we serve. So we need to understand to the extent that employees feel that's the case as well. Respectful workplace, and of course respect goes beyond diversity. Respect transcends diversity, but it's also part of diversity and inclusion. So very crisp. Of course, you can ask any question you want, but what we're seeing is these questions gauge the best in terms of when we're linking diversity, respect, and inclusion to levels of employee engagement. What are we finding? We're finding that most organizations are pretty healthy in this respect. On average, we're looking at around 3/4 of employees when we're asking these 5 questions, at least primarily in Canada. In the United States, it's a little bit different, because in the United States, what we're asking, we have, what's very interesting to notice, a little bit of a sidebar here, culturally in Canada, we don't tend to ask people for self-identification by race, whereas that's common practice in the United States and some other countries. In fact, some Canadian organizations get quite alarmed when they see that question coming in from their American counterparts. But nonetheless, we ask for ethnicity, and this is a form of that. So when we look at the race card a little bit differently in the United States, those numbers tend to be a little bit lower. I don't have any available today, but by and large, we're talking about 3/4 that are giving a favorable response, and the other quarter either unsure or completely unfavorable in about 11% of the cases. So it's relatively healthy, I think, but the key here is not necessarily the absolute value of those people that are feeling comfortable. And of course, we're not asking the diverse groups, we're asking all employees, so including the majority groups. And where the diverse groups fall, remains to be seen. But in terms of the majority and the overall employees in the organization, 3/4 are approximately feel they're answering favorable to the questions that I just showed you. But what's really key in this entire exercise is not necessarily that absolute value. It's how important diversity, respect, and inclusion is in terms of its impact on overall engagement. And here you see levels, well, we call it relative weight, and anybody who's worked with us has seen this as part of our presentation. We look at the various dimensions of engagement, ranging from professional growth to corporate leadership to information and communication to compensation. You can see the list in front of you. And when we include diversity and respect and inclusion in that equation, we see that it's very high on the list. It's something that we've been missing before. But now as we start to measure it, it becomes one of the top 2, 3, or 4 dimensions or drivers of engagement. What does that mean? It means the better we feel about those 5 or 6 questions that I told you, the more favorable that we are an inclusive organization, that we respect differences, that we feel safe and comfortable in our environment, in our work environment. That is having a positive impact on engagement. But more importantly, if we do not feel those things, if we do not feel diversity is respected, if we do not feel our organizations are walking the talk on this issue, that is having a detrimental impact on engagement. This is no longer a peripheral issue separate from the overall engagement of employees. It's part and parcel of the main equation. And that's really the key message to take home here. Any of you who are measuring employee engagement and who are not including questions in terms of the diversity, respect, and level of inclusion of employees in your organization are missing a key piece, or potentially missing a key piece of your employee engagement equation. And that's really the key take-home or takeaway from this particular slide. Not only that when we look at this in 2 spaces, when we're looking at both how we rate as an organization, better or worse than the benchmark top to bottom, and how strong that engagement driver is, we use this quadrant approach to identify areas of strength, which would be in the top right. Those are areas in which our organization is perceived to be better than average on the top, and having a strong impact on our engagement to the right. We see clearly diversity, respect, and inclusion can be a positive motivator for the organization, the case organization that this represents here. This was a key positive driver. Now, don't forget, we're not just surveying the diverse groups. We're surveying all employees in the organization. And one of the key takeaways here is positive results in terms of the views of diversity, respect, and inclusion. Not only are positive for those members of the diverse groups, but are positive for the entire organization, including us senior white males. This is impacting our engagement equally importantly as others. And so it's not only around policies and programs that are put in place to improve the work life of the diverse groups. It's having a spin-off in terms of feeling pride and optimism in the entire organization that we are doing a good thing. And that is instilling pride in the organization, and that pride is driving employee engagement. Very, very important to understand that. And now what I want to ask you is essentially, I'm going to open up my, bear with me here. We're going to open up and look at the different groups here. And I'm going to ask you if you can just enter into your questions or chat box. First of all, yes or no. I'm just going to start a poll here. So the first one we're going to touch on is, in general, would you say that women are more engaged than men in organizations? So it's time to vote. I'll give you about 10 seconds or so. Speed counts here. I'm not going to reveal the answers until we've gone through all of these. So still voting in. Still, we've got only about half voted. I'm going to wait for a little bit more here. We're up to 70%. Come on, a few more. You chime in. Let's go. All right, I'll stop it. We're at 73. Can we get to 75%? Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll stop it there. And essentially, we'll look at that. You can see 71% of you said yes, 29% of you said no. So let's keep that in mind. A large majority of you are thinking women are more engaged in their organizations than men. All right, let's go to the next one. Disabilities next. Let's get it a little bit quicker here. Are folks with disabilities less engaged this time? Are they less engaged than others? Are persons with disabilities less engaged than the majority in the organizations? Okay, we're getting faster at this. This is good. All right, let's stop it there. And most of you believe that those with persons with disabilities are not less engaged, or are equally or more engaged than the majority. So let's move on. Are visible minorities less engaged than the others? Talking about ethnicity. Visible minorities, are they less engaged than others? Up to 70%. Five more seconds. All right, time there. And as you can see, 81%, most of you believe, large majority believe that there are no differences by ethnicity. Next, we're going to do sexual orientation. Are those who declare themselves to be LGBTQ less engaged than the minority? 30 seconds. What do you think? Five seconds left. So we're seeing some consensus around here. So let's close that. Most of you, again, don't believe that there's any difference by sexual orientation. And we're going to do one more. We're going to do age. Are millennials more engaged than boomers or Xers? Now, if you've attended some of my other webinars, you should already know the answer to that question. But let's see. 30 seconds. Are millennials more engaged than boomers or Xers? Aha, this one's a little bit tougher. This one's more interesting. We're running neck and neck here. 5 seconds to go. And let's close that. And let's see, this one's a little bit tougher. This one, basically, we're saying we're split on this. So let's now turn to the answers.
And most of you got the right answers on most of the different diversity groups. Very interesting that a lot of you said that women are indeed more engaged, and the fact is they are, despite facing the disadvantages that women face in the labor market and in the workplace. They tend to be more engaged than men, woman for woman, man for man. Interestingly enough, though, they also indicate through our surveys and focus groups that they feel less able to express their voice at work. What does that mean? It means that often in meetings they're overshadowed by male colleagues who tend to be more assertive, more aggressive, more dominant. But when they're responding to the surveys, they're actually more engaged. They are more proud to work at their particular organization. They get more sense of personal accomplishment. They tend to be more optimistic. And the other indicators of engagement tend to be more positive for women than men. Of course, I'm generalizing here across all organizations. There are organizations where that's not the case as well, as is true with all of the rest of the groups. With regards to disability, this is where we see some gap. This is where we see an interesting phenomenon where those with a disability or indicate they have a disability are less engaged than their non-disabled colleagues. And really, the issue here is about accommodation and what accommodation sends as a signal to engagement. Accommodation for the disabled is the ultimate expression of inclusion. So where there's no physical or other accommodation provided, and the disabled are basically treated as quote unquote equals, then they don't feel as included because they cannot participate, whether or not it's the proper chair, the stairs, the elevator, whether it's accommodation for mental illness, what have you. If these accommodations aren't made, then there is less of a sense of inclusion, and that's what's leading to being less engaged than their non-disabled colleagues. For the remainder of the groups, there doesn't seem to be much significant difference in terms of engagement. So in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of race or ethnicity, in terms of religious affiliation, with one exception I'll talk about in a second, a notable exception. These groups, these diversity groups, tend to be as engaged or sometimes even more engaged than their majority colleagues. In Canada, however, we do see a difference between the engagement level of Aboriginals and significantly lower engagement among Aboriginals. And the unfortunate truth, the answer as to why is simple but stark. It's really racism. Aboriginals still complain about racism in the workplace, very nefariously, very closeted racism, but racism nonetheless. And of course, until and unless that's corrected, and until organizations show a zero tolerance policy in practice and in policy, then that's going to continue. So as long as there are those feelings of racism, there is going to be lower engagement. Interestingly, we don't find that the case across the board in what we've done in the U.S. We have seen organizations where racism has been an issue. These tend to be more organizations that tend to have unionized or manufacturing type or industrial type employees, where you have not only a race bias but a class bias as well, a level of importance bias. So in terms of engagement, Aboriginal, certainly there's work to be done, and of course in the United States, for all of the reasons that everyone sees in the media, the race issue is far from resolved. There's an enormous amount of effort that still has to be placed in there. With regards to age, finally, millennials, boomers, Xers, all equally engaged, and as a matter of fact, the number is 70%. 70% of boomers are engaged, Xers are engaged, 70% of millennials are engaged, all the same. So there's no difference here in terms of the level of engagement. However, we do see a trend, actually a cycle, with regards to the number of years of experience. So, and this is why many people, where we saw, 47% said actually that they felt the millennials are more engaged, boomers are less engaged, and 53% thought boomers are more engaged. Why we see that difference is because there is a difference in engagement by the level of experience. So as a new employee comes into the organization, they're at the highest level of engagement that they're ever going to be at. And this drops after a couple of years, falls to a floor after about 5 to 7 years, and then comes back very slowly where it rises again, the engagement level rises after about 20 years experience. And that's why we would confuse that with age, because many of our new employees are also young employees. But the determining factor here is the age, it's the time in the organization. So moving right along, essentially, what does all this mean in terms of diversity and inclusion in your organization for the level of employee engagement in your organization? Well, along with things like professional growth and organizational vision, we see very, very clearly that diversity and inclusion is an important driver of engagement. Sometimes in the top three. There's clearly a business case for diversity and inclusion. As a matter of fact, it should be stated more as inclusion and diversity as opposed to diversity and inclusion, because inclusion is the real name of the game here. Engagement requires more than value statements, more than affirmative recruiting, more than ideology. It requires the inclusion as well. And that's what drives the engagement. If the inclusion is missing, but the diversity is present through acquisition, through recruiting, it's actually going to be counterproductive. But the other thing that's very interesting that we see in our research and in our experience is it's not just an engagement driver among the diverse groups. When an organization truly values diversity and inclusion through its programs, through its policies, through its actions, through its management style, then the entire organization engages. Even us white males, us older white males, we tend to be very proud of our organizations for the sense of integration and inclusion that we provide to all employees, and that drives higher engagement overall. This also means that attitudes towards diversity and inclusion need to be measured as part of the engagement survey, not necessarily in separate measurement instruments, because there is a link, and we need to have that measurement inside the employee engagement to properly access that link. And then, of course, they need to be actioned accordingly. So like other engagement drivers, like other employee engagement issues, improvement comes from the bottom up. And just as with diversity and inclusion, it's going to be bottom-up employee participation as well as the accountability of senior leadership that's going to move engagement and diversity and inclusion forward. So what I want to do now is to show you a number of best practices. There's many, many best practices from organizations that are doing this right. The first one I'll talk about is inclusion. And the case here is one of my alma maters, PricewaterhouseCoopers, if you were paying attention carefully when I showed you the Diversity Inc. website. You'll notice PwC was number 5 in that list. They've been recognized as being quite avant-garde in this particular area. And they put out a white paper, a report on that really catalogs and describes their diversity and inclusion experience over the last 15 years. And they have a number of lessons learned in there. And the most important lesson learned, or one of the most important lessons learned, was that they said if they would have done it again, they would have focused on inclusion from day one. And their life cycle is very much like most life cycles in terms of the maturity model I showed you. They focused on compliance first. They focused on numbers first. They focused on getting the organization to look more like the clients that they serve through affirmative action hiring and things like that. But it was only once they started to focus on inclusion that they really started to see success. So there's a link on here where you can access through the PowerPoint presentation by clicking on that link, and it'll take you to that report. You can read much more. The real interesting one here is something called employee resource groups. I'm going to take you to a website that's by a company called Sodexo. Sodexo, if you're in a large institution, probably government or hospital or an organization like that, chances are very strong that your cafeteria is run by this company. Sodexo is also recognized by Diversity Inc. as one of the leaders in terms of diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that they do, actually two of the things that they do, they form employee resource groups. Now, employee resource groups essentially are groups of peers from which are members of the diverse minority. And they have a number of them across the organization. There's the African American Leadership Forum, there's one for veterans, there's one for the Intergenerational Network Group, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of these, you also have the link in the presentation that we're going to post. Each one of these has a video that explains what this group is all about. But basically, in a nutshell, what it does is it provides a sounding board. It helps, it acts as a go-to place for onboarding new diverse employees, for management instruction, coaching, and most of all, mentoring, because each of the members of these employee network groups or resource groups can act as mentors to new and existing employees of the diverse group to help them with challenges that they face in the workplace that are particular to their group's needs. And Sodexo has found, and so has Diversity Inc., has found that these resource groups are really a fabulous way, very effective way to ensure inclusion in the workplace. Of course, I mentioned mentoring, and Sodexo, in those videos, you'll see a lot about mentoring. It's very important in the inclusion process to provide buddies and mentors, especially to new employees. Diversity learning labs are ways essentially to bring training and development around diverse culture, around diverse needs, and you can read a lot more about these and other best practices just on that diversityinc.com when you see the link right in front of you. So as we move on, well, I'd like you to put down in your question box what are some of the things that you've been doing in your organization that you found that are working well in employee engagement. And while you do that, I'm going to take a quick second and to open up on my end some of the questions that you've been asking. So we'll take a look at that and give you a second here to input your results on that. And as we do that, I'll sort of pull up some of these questions. So I see one coming in right now. One of you is talking about a Taste of Diversity event where you had different, like a potluck. We do that here as at TalentMap as well. You said it works extremely well. And yes, it's food. We find in this, especially when we're talking about the ethnicity diverse groups, food is a wonderful way to start conversations around conversations that wouldn't take place normally. But when we're talking about food, we can explore the different cultural backgrounds of food and the different cultural needs. So kudos to you and your organization for doing that as well. Some questions here around best practices. I just showed you that particular slide. And here we have another question. And the question reads, how do you manage language issues, especially in lunchrooms where you have a large group speaking a language other than English, without making at least someone feel excluded? Language is a very, very touchy thing. I was born in Quebec, raised in Montreal, and as an Anglophone, an English speaker. So I can tell you very, very clearly how touchy this subject can be. Essentially, what I would counsel in this particular case is to let employees work out their own protocols in terms of how they're going to deal with minority languages. Resist the temptation to try and impose policy or guideline or impose language accommodation of any form. Of course, there's obviously my own cultural bias that's speaking here, but it's what I've found is when employees can come to their own understanding in terms of how to deal with minority language, you get that consensus that's a lot better overall than trying to impose something yourself. What I would do if I were in your shoes is make people aware that sometimes they're just not aware that someone cannot understand or someone's feeling excluded as a result of language, and to try to get somebody to try to accommodate, but then leave it be. That's essentially what I would counsel here. So as we come to the end of our webinar, thank you very, very much again for participating. On the screen in front of you, you see where TalentMap is going to be over the next couple of weeks and months. We're going to be doing a number of conferences and workshops together with the Conference Board of Canada in Halifax and Edmonton. We're going to be doing a number of conferences, the HR Technology Conference in a couple of weeks in Chicago, the People Analytics in Toronto in the beginning of November, and Canada's Top Employer Summit at the Four Seasons in Toronto. So hopefully we'll see some of you at these particular events. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your participation today. I'm hoping that this was a helpful webinar. Please, the webinar will be posted, both the PowerPoint and the recording. If you see that URL, take note, just basically go to talentmap.com/webinars and you'll be able to find it, or talentmap.com, and you can find it under, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see our webinars and events link. Thank you very, very much again. Have a good day.